Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, August 17th, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today continues with Phase 4 and our 19th webinar in the series of webinars on the topic of comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Its author and chairman of the committee is Neil Waldrop, for whom I am turning the facilitation of this webinar over to right now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate once again the opportunity to be with all of you. I look forward to a very interesting discussion. For the purposes of any viewers who watch us on YouTube, I would indicate that if you do not have the long discussion document, Revelation Revealed, already available to you, it would be helpful for you to download it. You can download it from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. Global Endeavor is treated as one word without any hyphen or other punctuation in the middle. The link that will enable you to download it is toward the bottom of the homepage of the website that I identified for you. In addition, since it is not possible for our viewers to ask questions while we are conducting the webinar, we offer you the opportunity of sending us in a question or two by writing to the email address that is listed at the bottom of the homepage. That email address is as follows: info@globalendeavor.net. If you send us a question, it should be in relation to something that someone says during our broadcast, or perhaps just ideas that you have while you are watching it. We reserve the right to edit your question if we decide to use it during a future broadcast. And in that event, your question would be answered by everyone participating in the panel that day, not just by me. So now I proceed to the substance of our webinar today. In effect, we are continuing our discussion pursuant to a single paragraph on page 109 of Revelation Revealed. That paragraph is headed D, Special Status for the Clergy. It is short, and so I shall read it. Special status for the clergy. Institutional Christianity distinguishes quite sharply between professional religionists, the clergy, and ordinary believers, the laity. Here we must note, however, that the clergy's prestige, privileges, and authority are crucial in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox branches of Christianity, whereas Protestant denominations are substantially less hierarchical, and some of them come close to being democratic. Now, in earlier webinars in this series, we talked about various characteristics of the different Christian denominations, and we have just started discussing the questions pertaining to the civil authority of the popes. This question has to do with the fact that the popes of the early to middle period of the Middle Ages established a kingdom, a civil kingdom in which they ruled as the civil rulers of about 1/3 of central Italy. And this kingdom lasted until the year 1870. Now, before we began discussing this, I reviewed passages in the Urantia book whereby Jesus states that his kingdom is not of this world. And that statement appears in 15 paragraphs of the Urantia book, and it likewise appears in one of the Gospels. In addition, Jesus stated, "Render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things which are God's," a statement that appears in 4 paragraphs of the Urantia book and in 2 verses of the Christian New Testament. This second statement, "Render unto Caesar," etc., establishes Jesus' view that the civil and religious realms are separate, and therefore one can read between the lines that for a religious ruler, in this case the Pope, to assert civil authority was contrary to Jesus' teachings and certainly not representative of them. So in preparing for this discussion, I circulated to the participants quite a range of attachments. And before we go into specific questions that are predicated on the contents of those attachments, I would like to review a paragraph that occurs in paper 19, section 1, paragraph 6, whereby a divine counselor comments on the need for a blend of origin, history, and destiny to understand any spiritual reality. The paragraph reads as follows: the true perspective of any reality problem, human or divine, terrestrial or cosmic, can be had only by the full and unprejudiced study and correlation of three phases of universe reality: origin, history, and destiny. The proper understanding of these three experiential realities affords the basis for a wise estimate of the current status. This is by way of explaining why we are going to spend the day talking about history. We have previously talked about how the Christian faith originated. We have spoken from time to time about its destiny and will continue to do so. But today we are talking about history, and that is because, as established by this paragraph of the divine counselors, one cannot really understand any reality problem unless history is included. So now I shall proceed to the first question of the series of questions that I circulated to the participants before, that is to say, before this webinar. This question is question number X2, and it pertains to something called the donation of Constantine. As a brief introduction to those of you who have not received this series of attachments, I will explain that the so-called donation of Constantine amounts to the assertion that the Emperor Constantine, before he departed for the eastern half of the Roman Empire and founded the new city called Constantinople, gave political authority to the Pope in the western half of the Roman Empire. This is a complete fantasy. It is a falsehood. It did not happen. But nevertheless, the popes of the day used this fiction as a device for exerting political authority. So now I read the question X2. The historian Norman Cantor refers to the so-called donation of Constantine as, quote, the best known forgery in history. How does this misrepresentation of historical events for the sake of one's own personal, organizational, or institutional advantage compare with the practices of historical revisionism, deception, and deliberate falsehoods that were standard techniques of the totalitarian regimes that operated in the 20th century, i.e. Nazi Germany, the former Soviet Union, and Communist China? Does there seem to be a broad parallel to the deceptive practices that George Orwell caricatured in his celebrated novel, 1984? Stephen, I would like to turn to you as the first panelist to respond to that question.
Thank you. Yeah, I take issue with the words misrepresentation and deliberate falsehoods. We are not sure that the people in power and the papacy at that time were guilty of a conscious misrepresentation or forming deliberate falsehoods in this case. I'll read a selection from one of the sources you gave us on the donation of Constantine on page 2. It says, the forged character of the donation of Constantine does not convict the 8th century popes of moral turpitude. The document was merely a legal way of expressing papal ideology. It is furthermore probable that the papacy actually regarded as true the peculiar interpretation of the history of Constantine's reign upon which the donation was predicated. The papal court in Rome was not able to find a copy of the document that they really believed Constantine had issued, so they forged their own version in much the same way as many medieval monasteries forged new copies of genuine charters that had been lost. So the idea of forgery that we have today is nothing like what existed in early medieval times. I would go so far as to say as the idea or intention of forgery did not exist. People had to reformulate documents that were lost all the time. That was not considered to be dishonest or a misrepresentation. So I think you're being anachronistic here in using and tendentious, using the words misrepresentation, deliberate falsehoods, and then comparing the papacy to Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and Communist China. That's all unwarranted, in my opinion.
Stephen, you have every right to your interpretation, and indeed you've read a passage from the material that I circulated as an excerpt from a book of history by the author Norman Cantor. I would pose to you, however, the question of the situation in the middle of the 1500s, after a Renaissance scholar had analyzed the Latin text used in the document and had demonstrated that it could not possibly have been written at the time of Constantine because the vocabulary and style of the document was not consistent with the style of Latin written in Constantine's day, and therefore was subsequent to his time, whereas the Pope of that day nevertheless commissioned the artist Raphael to depict a very large mural showing the Emperor Constantine kneeling before the Pope and giving this document. And this, of course, was something like 80 years after a Renaissance scholar had demonstrated the text to be false. What do you say about that?
Well, obviously that's true, and it took a while for the papacy to renounce its further beliefs, its former beliefs, and of course they're guilty of perpetrating that falsehood. It does take a while to turn an ocean liner around when it's moving, and it took them a while, and they can be held responsible for that. But I was taking issue with your interpretation of the initiation of the donation of the document, and that was what I was taking issue with. And of course, later popes were guilty of perpetrating that once it was shown to be a falsehood. I won't deny that.
Okay, George, your turn.
Yeah, I suppose you could say there's some parallels, although honestly, all organizations, all governments practice deception to one degree or another. It's a matter of degree. And I did take, along Stephen's line of thought, I took exception to the comparison with Nazi Germany, Communist Russia, and Communist China. You're comparing papal government to three of the most murderous and homicidal regimes that have ever been on this planet. So I think you're it's a grossly overwrought parallel.
Thank you, George. Bob, your turn.
Takes a second to get the mute off there, Neil. Thanks. Well, it's interesting. This obviously is a very controversial thought. George brought up an idea that I had been considering a little bit, a matter of degree, and that most political institutions tend to provide falsehoods. Well, a forgery is a fake, a counterfeit, a sham, a fraud, a dummy document. with all the research that had been gone into the fact that the statement that it's the best known forgery in history, I sure didn't know that it was a forgery. And that's why the study of history, after we've gone through the origin of this, is very important to really get a context for where we're going to be moving in the next set of our discussions, and in actually in the conversation that we're going to have just after this. So I take it that it is a forgery, and I asked the question, cui bono? You always have to ask that when there's been a falsehood. Brought up ideas of Howard Zinn, who was the late Harvard historian, who said to control the narrative, or I should actually first of all state what he said. He who controls the past controls the future. And I've listened to a lot of his old lectures. I said the late Howard Zinn. He's a little bit further left than even I am, I suppose. But it gets into some of these ideas. Create your own reality, create the narrative, and control not only the present but the past. As George brought up, there's lots of examples in the past where we're all political entities have gone into this to be able to benefit. Go back to the idea of cui bono. So I guess the comparison didn't shock me based on the idea that we're talking about revisionism. He who controls the past sets the narrative. Yes, it is deception, and certainly it is falsehoods. Those are certainly, as George said, the murderous previous institutions. But we should guard against those sorts of things. Where does it take us in this study? Well, I think it takes us to the idea that we're going to understand. I think I've understood that if the entire basis of this, the idea of the authority hierarchy, and once we get into the idea of infallibility, was based on a falsehood, then it changes the way that you perceive it. Back over to you, Neil.
Thank you. Doreen, I leave it to you to comment on any aspect of what other people have said or introduce your own independent reactions. But I would like you at least to include the question of why we are examining this issue only from the sake of a political system. After all, the Pope still declares himself to be a religious leader. And yet, the comparisons that I've heard from my counterparts so far, in effect, put the Pope in the category of a political leader. Please comment.
Oh, without a doubt. When I looked at the history, and I did read quite a bit other things than your own document, and what I had found, I think the correlation was there because he was God incarnate, and he said from Jesus to him, and that he was the Word, and he was the truth, and you don't question. And that's when, I started to remember when I was in communist country in Germany, in East Germany, before the wall went down. Well, I started looking at the consequences of those kind of actions. And you look over its history, and of course, they killed millions of people, and even other Christians, anybody who opposed them. So you try to keep people ignorant, in poverty. They were miserable. They had no opportunities, to develop their own personal relationship with God, because it was only through the Pope, and not only through the Pope, but when it showed the whole hierarchy of order of the priest having to be responsible to the next one in line, and the bishops, and it all goes up to he was the final bird. So it opened my eyes to a lot. And of course, they did the same thing in all totalitarian governments, whether it was Vietnam, was recent, but you absolutely shut them down. You don't question, you get rid of the intelligent people, the educated people, and of course, what results in demoralization. So that was quite evident. And of course, they said, I think in the last 200 years, since I think the church has eased up in all the, the wars and the things that have been perpetrated. And it said that they attempted now to obliterate the history, a lot of the history. And it's like, I guess, any government or that you want to make somebody a hero that maybe was a villain, and you want to ease up because it makes you look better. And we do it in every single country, and I read all the books and they do it. So the more recent books, of course, they color people as, oh, they didn't do what they actually did. So you eliminate history because truth, truth is something that, why would they have to know that? It doesn't serve our purpose. So I agree with Bob in a sense, it's always motive. And when I looked at all the motives that had taken place after, all those 1,000 years or 1,500 years of being, of each pope passing down their own agenda. Well, and then I found, which I thought was interesting, in that in the first 3 centuries of the church, it didn't have much power and it was harmless. And they had a brotherhood. They taught brotherhood and they taught tolerance and they taught peace and love and justice and a lot of things and mercy, what Jesus had preached. But then, of course, it changed. And so the extent of what happened afterwards, it really caused a lot of division and persecution. And the rest of the history. There is so much information that came across, too much to talk about here. But it was good for my education because I hadn't known any of this, or very little, only what the Urantia book said.
Well, Doreen, I'm glad you believe that I'm good for your education.
Well, if nothing else, thank you.
All right. Charles, it's your turn to wrap this up, at least as a matter of our answers to this particular question. But I have 2 elements that I hope you will comment on along with everything else. What the conduct of the various popes amounts to in terms of his essential spiritual responsibilities. And secondly, to what degree the fact that Constantine created the pattern of the linkage between church and state ended up being a template for the Pope to claim Constantine as the authority.
Well, there are a whole range of questions and subjects in those 2 generalizations and everything that's been said. Too much for me to take up too much time to comment on all of it, of course.
Well, then just tell us what you think is important,
well,
please.
I'm getting to that. That's thank you very much. I think first of all, we don't get much of a we don't really get much of a realistic sense, certainly not an idealistic sense, but a realistic sense of the Christian church the last 2,000 years by what I regard as a relatively narrow focus on the popes. The killings and deaths associated with the Protestant Reformation was throughout the system. The separation of Greek and Latin, East and West, was a system-wide eruption. The popes didn't have armies and navies. They have guards, they have bodyguards. Nowadays, they keep their machine guns, I'm not being facetious, they keep their machine guns discreetly hidden. When they use Swiss, you have to be a certain height. But they didn't have armies and navies. Charlemagne wanted to be crowned by the Pope because Charlemagne, wanted legitimacy in 800 AD. So I want to put that on the table. Secondly, on the table, the spiritual content of the Christian world, including the Roman Catholic world, a major part of it, is not indicated here. It did happen. As the so-called best-known forgery in history occurred, nonetheless, the large segments of the Christian world spiritually that went forward, even undertow, which I may bring up again in another context. The popes practiced a certain kind of union of church and state. Certain popes did and emphasize it more than others. That is true. They, Lord Acton, the great British political philosopher, talked about the general feature of human nature of having power and being corrupt, or having absolute power and being corrupted absolutely. That's generally true. In terms of the deceptive practices, you see that in modern advertising, and much of it in the modern advertising, for example. It is widespread because it's widespread in human nature and has been probably before history was written. In closing, let me make this observation. I agree with Stephen and George. I would go somewhat further. I've read George Orwell's Caricature several times, his novel several times. And many years ago, I haven't read it in decades, but I did study it. I read it and studied it. And his book, Animal Farm, two complementary novels. Orwell was writing about 20th century totalitarianism, which, as far as I know, the Christian world did not massacre by the millions. I don't know how they could have done that. You have to have an enormous infrastructure to do that. The Nazi Holocaust, for example, was a very complex operation and quite difficult to execute. They did it with enthusiasm and vigor, but it's quite difficult. The Soviet Union, likewise, to murder by the tens of millions, which is what the Nazis' Third Reich had intended, and the Soviets practiced in communist China by the millions. Well, these are enormous numbers. With these regimes, the practices of revisionism, I'm reading from the question, revisionism, deception, and deliberate falsehoods are not comparable to 20th century totalitarianism. Good heavens. In Orwell's book, in which he articulated these tendencies, I think very well, very accurately, entire lexicons were prostituted. Whole peoples and individuals were erased. The Soviets actually practiced the erasure of, and you know this, they practiced the erasure of individuals in photographs that were subsequently published on the same event in later books, so that these people weren't even visibly present. They practiced that. These totalitarian regimes are noted for their mass deception and mass murder, but they used those techniques to create whole new norms of dehumanizing humanity, of dehumanizing the individual personality, and dehumanizing entire groups of humanity, to murder them, to kill them, or to use them as slave labor and work them to death. The Soviet Union had hundreds, I mark this well, hundreds of concentration camps called gulags. They're concentration camps in which slave labor was employed. The Nazis had approximately 100 extermination centers and slave labor camps, concentration camps. Auschwitz was a concentration camp for purposes of slave labor on a mass basis. Historians estimate at any one point there were 100,000 personnel in them. Buchenau was the extermination center associated physically, geographically with Auschwitz, in which people were murdered immediately. They either worked to death or murdered immediately, or used in experiments and so forth. These were the things that were done to children are so awful, I'm not going to detail it, to suggest that there are broad parallels with the behavior of the Christian papacy, later Roman Catholic practice institution, in such behavior in the 20th century is more than a stretch. It really is a gross oversimplification. and fortunately, it never happened. There were the Inquisition did execute people, burn them alive. In the year 1542, William Tyndale was burned alive in England because he translated the New Testament from Latin to English. I believe his wife and children were forced to watch. I mean, these things occurred from time to time. I will say, by the way, and I know this is the case of Joan of Arc, the church didn't execute. The civil authorities, the actual civil authorities, the real civil authorities, carried out executions. The church's practice was not to do that. They didn't believe they should sully their hands with such things. But this is not comparable to 20th century totalitarianism, which is utterly hideous, iniquitous. And so I would say there is some blood on the hands of some popes. There is some, and there may be more dirt, but not any differently, as our George Pollock said, than the average political system, or morally, from a moral point of view, many modern advertisers. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Charles. I think it is important for me to clarify the intent of my question. I was not posing a question in which I implicitly compared the conduct of the popes with the totalitarian regime that massacred huge numbers of people. That was not my intention. I was comparing the technique of historical falsehood, telling a lie, or at least distorting the reality of history for practical and political advantage. That was the limit of my comparison. Now, in addition, we have the paradox here in which most of you have commented on the conduct of the popes in comparison with the conduct of other civil rulers. Why are the same standards applicable? The Pope is supposed to be a spiritual ruler. His authority in a civil sense was contrary to the teachings of Jesus, as I established at the very beginning by the quotations from the New Testament and from the Urantia book. So I maintain, and I continue to believe, that the whole question of the civil authority of the Pope was an abuse. It did not conform to his responsibility to transmit, reinforce the true teachings of Jesus. Stephen, I see that you asked for additional time.
Yeah. Okay. I agree that the Pope, in an ideal world, is a spiritual leader, but after the fall of Rome, the papacy did not live in an ideal world. I'll just read this excerpt I got from a Wikipedia article on the Roman Church. Quote, after the fall of Rome, culture in the West returned to a subsistence agrarian form of life. What little security there was in this world was provided by the Christian Church. The papacy served as a source of authority and continuity at this critical time. In the absence of a magister militum, that means a military ruler, in the absence of a military ruler living in Rome, even the control of military matters fell to the Pope. Gregory the Great, from 540 to 604, administered the church with strict reform. A trained Roman lawyer and administrator and a monk, he represents the shift from the classical to the medieval outlook and was a father to many of the structures of the later Roman Catholic Church. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, he looked upon church and state as cooperating to form a united whole, which acted in two distinct spheres, ecclesiastical and secular. However, by the time of his death, the papacy was the great power in Italy. So I'm just trying to reemphasize that the Roman Catholic Church existed in a vacuum, not only a political vacuum, but in a cultural vacuum and a social vacuum, that if it was not filled with some sort of what this article calls authority and continuity, the chaos and the darkness that we found to accumulate in the following centuries, I think would have been many times worse. Gregory the Great had a choice to make. He could either have ignored what was happening around him, which was virtually a collapse of civilization, or he could have taken some role in trying to preserve what was there. What he did was help to institute the monastic period in European history, along with Saint Benedict, of course. And between the two of them, many historians believe that they saved Western European civilization. I mean, I could go into the role of the monasteries. Most of you are already aware of it, but without Saint Benedict and without Gregory the Great, and without that intersection of spiritual, cultural, political influence, we would not have the world we have today. It would be a much worse world. The Pope did not live up to Jesus' ideal of a spiritual leader, but I'm not sure he had much of a choice at that point. So I'll sign off there.
Stephen, I understand your remarks. I would simply comment on the fact that what you have described in relation to the situation of those centuries at least has a plausible basis for the 5th century, the 6th century, and the 7th century. On the other hand, it does not seem to me a plausible basis for the subsequent several centuries, right up until the year 1870. After, shall we say, 800, when Charlemagne was crowned emperor, there were constituted civil rulers in Europe that had the ability to maintain order. There was no comparable need for the Pope to remain a civil figure. Nevertheless, he did that. And this assertion of civil authority by the medieval popes lasted all the way to 1870. So for my part, I cannot accept that the idea of disorder and the idea of a stabilizing influence that may be accurate in regard to the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries continued to prevail as a justification for the civil authority of the Pope right up to the year 1870.
Well, yes. I mean, power corrupts, and Roman papal personalities had a certain tradition, I suppose, that they felt that a certain power base that they felt they had to sustain. I'm not in favor of that, but I think as a trade-off in terms of what the church did to help to preserve Western civilization, you get the benefits and you get the downside of that as well. There is a downside, but there is an upside, and in my opinion, I think the upside way outweighs the downside. When you look at the influence of the Roman Catholic Church in starting universities in the West, and I mean, I can go on, but there are books written about how the Catholic Church saved Western civilization, and in terms of science and many other things, the church helped to get that way of thinking started. So there's always going to be trade-offs in history, and you can't just look at the negative side, and you can't just look at the positive side. I think, to be honest, you have a tendency only to look at the negative side, at least in this course. You only look at the negative side of what the Roman Catholic Church has done. I agree with a lot what you say, but I don't agree with your one-sided approach.
Thank you. As I have commented before, this is a vigorous discussion. We are emphasizing pluralism and diversity. You have every right to your views. In a previous contribution, you mentioned monasticism and monks and so on. We will discuss that. In fact, I believe that the succeeding section on page 109 of Revelation Revealed is indeed pertaining to monasticism. Therefore, we will discuss that at some depth in a future webinar. Bob, I see a motion for you to speak again.
Yeah, just one quick thing. I didn't talk about 1984 when I responded. Charles brought up 1984, out of all of us, but I thought that was a pretty profound part of the question, to be honest with you, Neil. I wanted to make some note of that. When I did go back and look at 1984, the book 1984, there were a number of themes, and two of the themes that I think were really important here that Charles brought up. I think both of them. He certainly brought up the totalitarianism, and I got thinking again about totalitarianism, ecclesiastical totalitarianism that paper 195 rails against, and says that it took a mighty power, and that mighty power was secularism. Interesting that they call secularism a mighty power. But the other theme was language. And I go back to the idea that if you can control the narrative, if you can control history, which is what it was almost like. I hate to say this, shooting fish in a barrel, as a metaphor. At that time, there, until the Gutenberg press, it was, taking candy or giving candy to the babies or taking candy from the babies at that point. So it was a slippery slope. Power corrupts, certainly. But the other idea that I wanted to bring up was language, because 1984 spends a lot of time with this idea of news speak, meaning that the way to control the narrative is to change the language. And frankly, I think that that's the slippery slope that has not been talked a lot about. And hopefully when we get into the next couple of sections or questions, I should say, we should be able to kind of expound upon that a little bit more. But strong thoughts here, and I have to say that there are quite a few parallels there. Over.
Thank you, Bob. I think you've given me an entry point to the next question. We've had a vigorous discussion of question X2, and therefore I shall read question X3, which indeed has to do with credibility and believability. Question X3 reads as follows: although there is little reason to infer that Michael Cellularius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, was impressed when Pope Leo IX mentioned the so-called donation of Constantine in an official document that he sent to Cellularius in the year 1054, Christians living in Western Europe appear to have accepted the validity of the so-called donation for quite a few centuries, until the Renaissance. Why did the popes of those centuries get away with these palpable falsehoods? Charles?
Well, I think because it's human nature to be sheep-like, frankly, meaning to follow blindly, generally speaking. This is the general run of societies. Those who are very wealthy and powerful and politically powerful, or powerful in other respects socially, are generally taken as small g gods, as they're treated like deities almost. And it's no coincidence that Jesus used the metaphor of the shepherd over the sheep. I think that's the root of the answer to the question. The popes had a prestigious position of the highest possible human status in the context of organized Christian religion, generally. And I agree with the thrust of Stephen's argument that roughly after the 4th century, on up to at least the 14th century, just prior to the emergence of the modern nation states, Europe was in need of some kind of centralizing authority. And the Christian church filled that need. It also served in a civilizing role. The Vikings, for example, probably I've often thought I think their evolution was accelerated somewhat because of the influence of Christianity. Same things with the Russians. And but the status of the Pope, the status of the city of Rome as a carryover from the Roman Empire, was very, very high. And people always look up to the peak. You can't look at level with the peak. You have to look up with the peak, a mountain peak, something that's high like that. The way the question is worded, to get away with these palpable falsehoods, seems to presume that people read very close. Most people couldn't read, first of all. Bear in mind, the vast majority could not read. That's why the Irish monasteries, for example, helped to save Western civilization. And Stephen is correct. There are books on that subject, as you know. So I'm not quite sure, but I mean, when you have the popes as father figures of society at large, remember, now we're not just talking about a domain in the peninsula of Italy. The church's influence, therefore the Pope's name and status, particularly the status, had an influence throughout Europe, and was, generally speaking, looked up to, and generally speaking, respected. Most people couldn't read. Even many of those in power, political power, couldn't read. It was a long time before the kings of England could read, were literate. Charlemagne was not. He was buried with books, we found out, but he couldn't read them. But he respected them. They were almost magical. I think it's nothing more than that. I think these deceptions, to some extent, are from a father figure, an institutionalized father figure, not the actual person so much as the institutionalized figure, held sway because of their status. And most people, if they gave it any thought at all, the average aristocrat gave it any thought at all, if they did, would have simply accepted it the way people generally follow the lead, insofar as a leader is concerned, somebody of very high status is concerned.
Thank you, Charles. I will comment on one very specific minor point that you happened to mention, that my recollection is slightly different in regard to Charlemagne. To my understanding, or at least to the degree that I remember, he was able to read, but he could not write. He tried to learn to write, but failed. This was because he was not turned to write. He was not taught to write as a person growing up, and tried to learn to write well after he became an adult. But I could be
mistaken. A professor of this period made that statement. Perhaps the professor was incorrect. I've never investigated it very, very much.
Well, in any case, that's only a very minor point of your comments, but I appreciate your general analysis. George, I would like you to comment, if you could, on the relationship of this question and why the popes got away with these falsehoods by adding the dimension of the educational system as it existed and who controlled the educational system.
As I understand it, the Middle Ages period apparently we're talking about, and the late Middle Ages extend beyond the 13th century. All government, all religion, all education was authoritarian. There was no democracy, there was no debate, there was no discussion. Everything was handed down. So this was a general, pervasive feature of Western culture. So I don't see this as the popes getting away with something that people were aware of. I think it was more along the lines of a few people may have been aware of it, but the authoritarian nature of the entire culture effectively prevented any rebellion at that time. The rebellion happened later during the Reformation.
Thank you. Bob, your turn.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, a couple of thoughts. And I have to go back to the question because I was a little, while I really liked the last question, this one confused me a little bit because of the term why, of the part of it why. I thought, well, maybe it's more how did the popes of those centuries get away with these palpable falsehoods? And if there was a why in front of it, I kind of had to translate it in my mind to say, why did the popes of those centuries decide to use those palpable falsehoods? So I kind of approached it that way. So let me explain how I came across, or how I answered the how first. And I think it goes back to what's been said already, that the vast majority, Charles already said this, so people couldn't read. We've talked about this before. Also think that if we look back to the Lucifer rebellion and the false liberty and the chaos that ensued for nearly 200,000 years, or at least 150,000 years from the time that Van and Amadon had tried to establish some sanity on the planet. I think that it's a harbinger of how things were going to have to try to be fixed, I suppose. Adam and Eve didn't do it. That's a part of their I guess that once they finally came here and they realized, oh my gosh, this is a little bit harder than I thought. So some of this was, I suspect, a little inevitable. But the illiterate, I think the general population who was illiterate, and as I said before, with the two metaphors I just had said before, I think that's how that happened. But I think the why was, Cantor speaks of the why here, and let me just read what, and it's something that Steve brought up earlier. He wrote, given also the respect that men in a largely illiterate society accorded written documents, it is easy to understand the propensity of churchmen in the Middle Ages to forge documents to establish a legal basis for their claims. As I said, Steve had read that, and I kind of focused on that myself also. The forged character of the donation of Constantine does not convict the 8th century popes of moral turpitude. Moral turpitude is, both forgery and moral turpitude are pejorative terms. Moral turpitude is an act of baseless violence, depravity in private and social duties, or to society in general. So, the document, he ends it in saying that the document was merely a legal way of expressing papal ideology, but still it's a slippery slope. Still, I believe that as we fast forward to today, that this pattern has been set, and this pattern has been set not only in civil but in up until the Reformation, when there were some breakaways. And they basically broke away and didn't break away hard enough to be able to basically unleash this totalitarian aspect, because I think that's the slippery slope. Is that when both aspects of society that we're talking about are built on falsehoods, it's almost inevitable that totalitarianism, either secularism or ecclesiastic will be the inevitable result. So I think it's a slippery slope, and I think it's one that, knowing the history of this, will then allow us to be able to forge new thinking going forward. Over.
Thank you. Doreen, I would like to try to move the discussion at least a little bit toward the question of the circulation of information and how it was controlled. We have a situation now of relatively free circulation of information, but there are some regimes, notably Communist China, that try to restrict what people have access to. And they have a system which has been colloquially referred to as the Great Firewall of China, whereby they prevent the people of China from focusing on downloading from websites in Western countries that talk about democracy and freedom and so on. Well, my question then has to do with the circulation of information during this period we are examining. Who controlled the circulation of information? Who controlled education?
Okay. So I had read that the Benedictine order founded the schools and the libraries and the scriptures, and they function as major educational institutions in the early Middle Ages. They preserved many classical texts and estimates about 90% of the literate men between 600 and 1100 received their instructions from those monastic schools. And it said, as their role in society grew, well, what happens then, you know? Rulers and nobility rewarded them with vast manor, homes, and property, and they became the advisors to the kings. Now, who is going to contest that? You know, those that know, you know, knowledge is power, and power really counts. So to say, let me see, to think about, I don't want to veer off, but what was your exact question to me? You said who was running the schools? How did the information, well, they couldn't, because I was talking to actually somebody that is right here in my area, and he's from Poland, and he's been here about a dozen years in this country or less. And I asked him the same question, and I said, wait a minute, when the church came in and changed Poland, you know, into a Catholic state, how come people didn't protest? He says, where were they going to run? They had no transportation, no money, no place to go. You were absolutely controlled by the powers that had been. And this is with any other authoritarian order of people. And it's today and it's yesterday, and hopefully, you know, it'll change. But it really gave me some pause, you know, because it said even Pepin, you know, you're talking about with the donation, they said he was illiterate and he wouldn't have known the documents that he even signed, but others did know. And they did it because they all had something to gain. It's always, you wash my hands and I'll wash yours. And it's nothing new, it's human nature. But to perpetuate the falsehood for your own power and then continue to dominate people's lives in every area and keep them in the dark without knowledge. So when you mentioned, and I'll jump around just a bit, China, I was in China. You couldn't say a word. They stood behind the poles watching the guide, whatever she said to our group. And she said, stop asking me questions. They're gonna lock me up. It was terrible. And this was about 1981. So it wasn't where, oh yeah, people could, you know, say with you could not. The threat and the fear of death and imprisonment, it's always runs the course with every totalitarian group of people. So I don't care about the scale. You know, when Charles talked about the scale of no comparison, of course there's no comparison. But World War II, you know, they started murdering people from what, 1938 until 45, and then it was over. But the church had, what, 1,500 years or more to do their dastardly deeds. And I don't fault them. I agree with Stephen. They are not entirely bad. Nobody is. They have produced wonderful things and educated people in, you know, in the schools. But I have lots of different books I was going through just to find some understanding, and that it doesn't make sense. It had nothing to do, as you said, with Jesus' teachings, but as you once said to us when we came first with this subject matter, you said they made it up as they went along, and that's exactly what I found. They made it up, and everybody who was in power made up something else, changed the doctrines, changed and I can give you so many examples that they listed of documents that were absolutely erroneous. They put in their own ideas if it didn't match what you're thinking of. But anybody who writes history does the same thing. I know you're in a hurry, so I won't prolong this conversation.
Well, Doreen, I appreciate your insights and your contributions. I think that you have unlocked the question of the psychology involved. Others have talked about that too, but I believe that Stephen is the final person to have an opportunity to answer this question. Am I correct? You have not yet gotten a chance, Stephen?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I'm not sure exactly what the question is at this point.
Well, the question is why the theory that the popes possessed civil authority from an action of Constantine was accepted, and why the popes got away with that falsehood for about 1,000 years.
Yeah, well, I think that's already been explained by Charles and others. It just has to do with power. The papacy had the power, and the rest of the population was fairly ignorant. So not hard to pull the wool over people's eyes when people don't have means of accessing, what actually happened. There was a fairly esoteric thing to look into. I mean, you're talking about a few intellectuals who figured out it was a forgery, and given the state of communication at that time, it didn't get around very, very quickly or very efficiently. So that's the answer: power and general lack of education on the part of the populace. I do want to get back to briefly to the second question, X2, and where you use those examples of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, etc. Yeah, I mean, you can limit that to misrepresentation of historical events, but you don't need to use examples like the worst governments that ever existed in the history of the world. I think the analogy is much closer to any typical government of any democratic state who, for its own purposes, will lie and misrepresent to its people. The United States government does that all the time. Other governments do that all the time. So if you want to make an analogy, I think it's an unfair analogy to use the most extreme governments that ever existed. So I think that the use of those examples is misleading in itself and unnecessary. As far as who's controlled the education in medieval Europe, early medieval Europe, the monasteries did. And the idea that the papacy in Rome controlled these monasteries is wrong. They did not control these monasteries. The church at that time was extremely decentralized because of lack of transportation, lack of communication. There was no internet. There was no way for the Pope to know what the Irish monks were doing on an island off the coast of Ireland. And these monasteries, all of them, went about their business with little or no attention paid to whatever the Pope was doing in Rome. So to think that the papacy controlled education in medieval Europe is wrong. And not only that, the church did help the establishment of major universities in Paris and elsewhere. And those universities had enough freedom of thought to instigate what later became the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And those were church-founded institutions. So they were very, very far from any kind of centralized totalitarian control of education in Europe. It was quite the opposite, actually.
Thank you. I think that the points you've made are valid intellectually. I would simply put a slightly different emphasis on the fact that the entire educational system, whether it was on the part of monks or in some other institution, was in the hands of clergy. The educated people were clergy. The system of education was run by clergy. There were no public schools in our terms. The government did not provide education. And so all education, our instruction, was in the hands of clergy. Although one will certainly agree, I will certainly agree with you that the monks in various locations were not immediately obedient to the Pope, but they were part of the religious institution of clergy. And yes, they had their own ability to analyze matters, but no one seemed to doubt the assertion of the authority that undermined the so-called story about the donation of Constantine.
Monks were not considered clergy. Monks, unless they were also priests, were not considered clergy. And they were independent in that way, unless they had some formal relationship with the church. So monasticism and clericalism are two different phenomena.
All right, this is a question of vocabulary. I think that most people would consider monks to be part of the church institution. If you don't want to use the word clergy for them, that's fine. That's, again, a matter of definition. But they were instructed in the principles of the doctrines of the Christian faith at the time, and one would associate them with religion in a very broad sense. I believe that's fair. I see you're nodding. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will now go on to question X4, which really zooms forward into the middle of the 18th, into the middle of the 19th century, the 1800s, and it pertains to a document issued by Pope Pius IX in 1864, whereby, in effect, he condemned various ideas that were circulating at that time, the middle of the 19th century, that had the net effect of calling into question some of the traditional doctrines and teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. So the question X4 reads as follows. In effect, the Syllabus of Errors, December 8, 1864, consists of a series of analytical statements and opinions that Pope Pius IX formally condemned in attachments 6 and 7. On the understanding that the Church's assertion of authority over marriage and the enactment of many ecclesiastical laws and regulations constraining marriage and regulating it did not occur until after the year 1000, please comment on the following paragraph and its implications. The paragraph reads as follows, quote, 65, the doctrine that Christ has raised marriage to the dignity of a sacrament cannot be at all tolerated. Apostolic Letter ad Apostolicae, August 22, 1851, unquote. And again, for the purposes of seeking to understand this statement, in effect, the Pope of that day, Pius IX, is condemning those who make this statement. George?
I don't see anything unusual here. It's just the totalitarian mindset exerting its control over yet another area of human activity, namely marriage. I don't think it's any more complicated than that.
If I could just probe you slightly, you're saying that this was part of the Church's assertion of authority over marriage. Am I correct?
As another example of what totalitarian organizations always do, they overreach. Totalitarianism can't stand the thought that there's anything that's beyond their immediate control. So marriage, before 1000, marriage was not a matter of Christian dogma. It became that because they just couldn't stand the thought that they didn't control it. So when people started to challenge that dogma in the 19th century, the Pope said, well, you're not allowed to challenge it. I mean, it doesn't seem any more complicated than that to me.
Thank you. Charles, the underlying idea here is that Jesus established marriage as a sacrament. Literally, the wording said, has raised marriage to the dignity of a sacrament. Would you comment on that teaching?
I don't have too much to say. When I was a student in elementary school, they taught us religion in the first half of the 1950s, when the church was much more traditional from today's point of view. The impression was that marriage was sanctioned by God. I don't remember Jesus being mentioned, but that was the impression conveyed. And the marriage ceremonies I attended in Roman Catholic churches by Roman Catholic priests said as much, and that impression was left. I never thought much about it, up or down. That the church would make it its business at a certain point follows because, as George said, it's a part of society, it's a part of life with its own status, its own importance, that the church would make it its business at one point to either control or influence or otherwise define in terms of what was legitimate and what was not and how you acquired legitimacy. But my sense has always been that its legitimacy rests with God. God's as a sacrament and as an institution. What God has joined together, let no man pull asunder. It was a common running theme, notwithstanding the 1851 statement.
Thank you, Stephen. You're muted, Stephen. You're still muted.
Yeah, I was in the middle of looking something up. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, what I was trying to look up, I think that in the New Testament, Jesus does talk against divorce. I'm not absolutely sure about that, but I believe he does make a statement about that. I could be wrong. I think Paul definitely does. So for the church to have that opinion is certainly not surprising, assuming that it does exist as a statement of Jesus in the New Testament. Of course, I am not comfortable with the church trying to insert itself into the what I consider to be secular rights of citizens, and I don't think that belongs to the repertoire of what the church should be doing, along with a lot of other interventions that they were trying to make into society. So I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. I would agree with you that these statements about divorce not being allowed do occur in the New Testament. Revelators tell us that they were insertions by followers of Jesus who inserted their own ideas, not his, that Jesus did not teach on that subject, or at least he did not teach a prohibition about divorce. Doreen?
Oh, yes. Well, I did look up in the Arantra book what Jesus said, and he said on the marriage, it says the union of husband and wife in the marriage home relationship is a material function of mortals of all evolutionary worlds. True indeed, much spiritual progress may accrue consequent upon the sincere human efforts of husband and wife to progress, but it does not mean that marriage is necessarily sacred. And I read a lot, and I came across one. She was a nun, and I had met her in, I think she teaches in Georgetown, and I had met her at the Parliament, and that's Karen Armstrong, and very involved in interfaith work. Well, she put out something that I was appalled that the church had written. And they were in every aspect of your sexuality, your sexual marriage, what not to do it on Wednesday because Wednesday was the day before Christ arose, not Thursday. And then the stuff I would read you, I fell off the chair when I was reading this. And actually a Muslim friend of mine asked me to send it to her because she works with women as well. And it says there was a ban on intercourse during festivals and feasts and fasts and 40 days before Easter, Pentecost, Christmas, 7, 5 or 3 days before the communion and so on. And it was crazy. And positions they taught, they had a whole regiment on your personal relationship in your marriage. And this is really over the top. Apparently, she said they really regarded sex as a sin only for procreation. And she had a lot of information if anybody was interested to look it up. But I just nearly fell off my seat, had no idea how intrusive the state became after that. And to this day, you know, there are still laws on the books here, you know, about how and what to do. And some people, they say down south, had gotten arrested several decades ago for practicing certain positions. So I'm telling you, everything has, you know, has legs. It's not just what somebody said a couple of 100 years ago, but it's what they want to believe, that maybe the authority is right. And if I don't want to sin, and I will listen, you know, to the authorities in charge. But it was amazing. Anyway, too much to talk about here.
I appreciate your comments. I think that one point that may be worthwhile in the background is that these rules were created by males who ostensibly practiced celibacy, although that was not perfect. But the input of women into any of these questions was negligible or non-existent.
Yeah.
Bob, your turn.
Yes, thanks, Neil. Something Steve said posed a little bit of a conundrum for me, or a paradox that I want to address here with what we're talking about. Steve, I wrote down, you said that the papacy did not control the monasteries, which would kind of lead me to believe, yes, I agree. We, at that moment there was very little travel. There was no communication in the way that we understand communication. There must have been some, but as this question that we're addressing now came up, it really required me to go look at the list of popes and find out, why was Pope Pius IX, which is the one we're talking about here, getting to the First Vatican Council, talking about all these errors. And from what it seems as though that a couple of popes in front of him, Gregory the 16th was the one in front of him, and thank goodness for Google Books, because there was a great compendium of the history of how these popes started to think. Well, there was a document that came out before the Vatican that Gregory the 16th opposed the democratic and modernizing reforms in the papal states, and he wrote in his encyclical about matrimony. He says, recalling that matrimony is a sacrament and therefore subject to the church, let them consider and observe the laws of the church concerning it, meaning the laity. Let them take care lest for any reason they permit that which is an obstruction to the teachings of the canons and the degrees of the councils. So as George brought up, totalitarianism, continues to expand upon itself as it's able to do, as it's able to gain more power. So I got thinking about what Steve said about that the popes in the earlier part of Middle Ages did not control the monasteries. Well, maybe that's not such a conundrum anymore when I start thinking about, okay, in the 19th century now, it now required the Pope, with the Industrial Revolution at full force now, to try to retain this totalitarian hold that maybe wasn't really as strong as we kind of think it was. Although it appears as though that there was a common form of teaching, because even the Jesuits went into South America, still performed and taught in very much of the same ways as the Benedictines and the Dominicans, with slight variations, of course. So Pius X was the most controversial with the syllabus of errors, because there was a number of categories, matrimony happening to be only one of them. Infallibility was what really came out of Vatican I, which put the complete stamp on everything that said Now I have complete totalitarian control. If I'm the infallible, if the church pope is the infallible one, now I really have control. So I know another question is going to come up in a second here, but I wanted to read something from the introduction by Hans Kung that seemed to make a whole heck of a lot of sense about this topic. Because he's talking about infallibility, of course, and I know we're going to get to that, but I have to fast forward to this because it kind of caught my eye. And he's talking about contraception, of course, and he mentions Pius IX. And he says, this teaching, which forms the basis of Humanae Vitae, which is an encyclical that came out later, I don't have who actually wrote that one, has laid a heavy burden on the conscience of innumerable people, even in industrial developed countries with declining birth rates. But for the people in many underdeveloped countries, especially in Latin America, it constitutes a source of incalculable harm, a crime in which the church has implicated itself. And one more sentence here. High birth rates are linked to the cause-effect relationship with poverty, illiteracy, unemployment, malnutrition, and disease. In the last 2 decades, most of the gains, by no means insignificant, in food production among the third world nations were wiped out by population growth. It gets a little bit political there, I suppose, but taking all of this into consideration, it's a pretty significant impact on society globally.
Thank you, Bob. I would simply try to fill in a couple of blanks in your statement about the details that Humanae Vitae was an encyclical condemning all forms of contraception other than the rhythm method. And subsequently, popes used their same authority to condemn abortion under any circumstances. I think these two elements of society are probably the most recent examples of the effort by the papacy to use the authority of the papacy to issue edicts to civil society in ways that constrain the behavior of human beings. There may be other issues as well. And one can broadly associate that with the doctrine of infallibility, although I think it is only broad. The technical narrow level of defining infallibility does not reach these kinds of declarations, but people commonly assume that if the Pope is infallible, then what he says about contraception is an issue of obedience. I think we have gone through the series in regard to question X4, and therefore I would like to proceed to question X5, which is more of a conceptual matter. X5, in the introduction to the book by August Bernhard Hasler, written by the German theologian Hans Kung, he repeatedly mentions the Roman Catholic teaching called, quote, the magisterium, unquote. In brief, the word magisterium comes from the Latin word for master, the same concept that is the basis for a master's degree. From a theological perspective, the idea of the magisterium amounts to asserting that the Roman Catholic Church is the master of all Christian doctrine and has the authority to insist on conformity, uniformity, and obedience. Please comment. Now, I will recognize Stephen first because I suspect that he will take issue with my definition of the concept of magisterium. And before he does that, I will state that I was giving a very broad and general description, not necessarily a technical definition. Stephen?
Yeah, okay, I'll leave that alone then. Yeah, I mean, I am not a fan of the idea or the practice of the magisterium. I will say, though, that if you have a club, you can think of the Roman Catholic Church as a big club that you're a member of. And like any club, it has certain principles and ideas that in order to be an upstanding member, you're expected to believe in. Of course, the magisterium was more dictatorial than most clubs would be, but they saw the need to have some order in that club because of the rising power of secularism and atheism. And I think they were probably worried about the coherency of their teachings being diluted in the general culture. And they wanted to set up parameters for belief to help their members, I suppose, is how they thought about it. It's not surprising. It's not anything that I would agree to. It's not a club I would join, especially with the idea of infallibility thrown in there. But it's understandable. When the church was the big dog in town, and it didn't have any true competitors like the power of the secular state or science or whatever, it had no need for that sort of thing. But come the middle of the 19th century, they were on their heels. And I think they felt the need to define themselves more clearly so they knew what they were about and their members knew what they were about. So this is not a justification. It's just an explanation for why they felt they had to do that at that point in history, where it was not felt necessary before that. It's explicable in that sense.
Thank you, George. Before I yield to you, giving you the floor, I would ask you to comment on the implications of the term the magisterium in relation to the issues that were ventilated very thoroughly in the Protestant Reformation. Do you think that, in effect, the Protestant Reformation was a way of challenging and contesting the idea of the magisterium, the authority of the Roman Catholic Church in all regards?
Yeah, I think so. As I understand it, the magisterium is essentially a common set of beliefs for people who want to belong to the Catholic Church. It's both the written and oral record of the Church, and it's what you have to believe to be a member. If you want to be, a perfectly good member in standing, you have to believe everything in the magisterium. And of course, the Protestant Reformation is completely threw that over. Neither the Pope nor the clergy has the right to overrule the straightforward interpretation of laymen, their interpretation of the Bible, which is the real authority.
That was, I'm sorry, that was the view of the Protestant reformers, yes?
Yeah, yes. They rejected the magisterium in favor of a personal interpretation of the Bible, which they believed was the Word of God.
Thank you. Charles, would you comment on the relationship between the phrase the magisterium on the one hand to a collection of doctrine, and on the other hand, second element please, to the authority to insist on doctrine?
One follows the other. If you tie magisterium to doctrine, it doesn't make sense not to insist upon it. And that goes along with
what do you see as the, I'm sorry, did you want to continue that comment? I didn't mean to cut you off.
It goes along with the notions of conformity, uniformity, and obedience. Of course, you're going to insist on it. Churches never claimed to be a democracy.
So if I simplify my own question, you agree implicitly that the idea of magisterium is not only the contents, but the authority to insist on those contents, yes?
Well, it eventuates from it. That's what I'm saying. It eventuates from it. It follows. It's wait a minute. I don't know how to. I would just be paraphrasing myself to continue with that point, but it follows. And as an eventuation, authority is meant to be used. Authority is not not something that people, human beings generally treat only in the abstract. Authority is implemented in the concrete. So, of course, enforcement would follow in various forms. And you might excommunicate. That could be a means of enforcement. You might publicly chastise or privately chastise. That could be an attempt at it. Galileo was put under house arrest, and he was warned not to publish anymore. I mean, it's in his day. Today, they wouldn't put you on house arrest. They couldn't. I mean, they couldn't in societies like ours, democratic societies. But they could excommunicate you, or the equivalent. I mean, I think that's just elaborating on what would follow it. It's magisterium is a concept. It's a value judgment, a conceptual frame of reference or point of reference. The actions based upon it are stated in the question, or stated in the paragraph. Again, conformity, uniformity, and obedience. Particularly, well, they all go hand in hand. When you obey, you conform. You conform, you obey. And if enough people do it, you have the uniform. You don't have unity, you have uniformity.
Thank you. Doreen, do you see anything in this question about magisterium that goes beyond the authority to insist on uniform belief? Is there something more to it?
Well, what I found, it said the statement on the Pope's authority was approved after they had a long debate about this. It wasn't just simple. Before and during the council, they said the decree states that the true successor of St. Peter has full and supreme power of jurisdiction over the whole church, and that he has the right of free communication with the pastors of the whole church and their flocks, and that his primacy includes the supreme teaching power to which Jesus Christ added the prerogative of papal infallibility. I mean, you're telling me that this is not made up stuff? It says, whereby the Pope is preserved free from error. Remember, he's a human being, but he's free from, because he is, he has to be, of course. He has to tell the people that, I am who I am. And of course, if people lost faith in what he said or the church, he would lose the following. So I thought it was amazing. It says, so the Pope is preserved free from error when he teaches definitely that a doctrine concerning faith or morals is to be believed by the whole church. And it said the original schema had not included a statement of papal infallibility, but the majority of the council fathers, urged on by Pius IX, overrode the vociferous opposition from those who argued that a formal definition was inopportune and gave their approval to the dogmatic definition. And this is 1870. Everything that I open, I find, and I'm not just looking at negative stuff, but it just comes up, in doctrine after doctrine with many different writers. Whether they plagiarized each other, I don't know, because there was no, the documents, of course, were never accurate, and whoever was, they got rid of a lot of documents because, of course, they wanted to control the message. So, okay, whatever it is. And, people at that point, I think where the church started to lose its power anyway. So they started to get educated and wake up and know you're not absolute, you're not God, and you're not perfect. So anybody who wants to believe that, how could, it doesn't make any sense.
Thank you. Bob, I will, of course, turn to you now since the others have all had an opportunity. It seems to me that the three words that I used in the final line of this question, conformity, uniformity, and obedience, are pretty close to a paraphrase of the four premises that we identified when we considered my essay Romanità. And that essay focused on the techniques of, or the implications of what Constantine did. I think the four principles that were identified in that document were authority, hierarchy, conformity, and explicitly defined responsibilities and roles. It seems to me, looking at this, that the term the magisterium is simply a way of condensing all of the above. Do you largely see it the same way?
Yeah, that's interesting, Neil. Yes. I have to say, unequivocally, yes. It's interesting. I hadn't thought about the conformity, uniformity, and obedience, but I saw magisterium as being the third leg of the stool, to be able to draw a circle around all those and get them all accomplished at the same time. And let me just put the three legs here together. So this may be a metaphor a little bit, I don't know, but the authority structure is the first scripture. So it's the written word of God. The church says that the Bible is divinely inspired, much as though Protestantism does, and it's authoritative. The second leg is tradition, and it's an authoritative element. And in reading some of the literature of those who have left the priesthood, they were driven hard with that tradition idea, which refers to the teachings of Jesus that he orally communicated, who then orally communicated those teachings to their successors, the bishops, up until this day, and they protect that tradition. But without the third leg, which is the magisterium, that's the authoritative element, and this teaching consists of the Pope together with the bishops in unity. And because if we look at what the magisterium, it's really a sacred, codified in everything, in the creeds, the councils, the catechisms, the Latin textbooks. So with those three authoritative structures, or those elements, I should say, of the authoritative structure, that you get conformity, uniformity, and obedience all wrapped up into one, and the game's over. Now, just to juxtapose that, as you brought up, Protestantism doesn't have those three legs. They have the one leg, sola scriptura. And I think there's probably some discussion at some point as to how does that sola scriptura, just the sole scripture as the guiding magisterium, how does that operate in a different kind of an organization, other than the one that has all three legs? I don't think I know the answer to that, but I just brought that up for thinking for later. Over.
Thank you. That's a very interesting comment. I think most likely sola scriptura, scripture alone, does not automatically entail uniformity. Do you agree?
I don't know. There is an apparent uniformity to me in my experiences over these 70 plus years of experiencing in different church elements, that there seems to be a large uniformity, but there is some interpretation which is slightly different, but highly uniform, almost paradoxical as the idea Steve brought up, that in the Middle Ages there was no concentrated communication. There's something else going on here, and I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I think there's some degree of uniformity, even though it doesn't appear that that's the case.
Well, I take your point as a matter of my own interpretation, that there is some degree of uniformity, but there is also diversity, because the different denominations take the same books of the scripture and emphasize different elements. Do you agree?
Yes. Yes, and I'm certainly not capable of commenting on that, but something that certainly want to do a little bit more research in the future.
Thank you. I think now we've largely concluded our discussion on the question pertaining to the magisterium, which is question X5. Question X6 is a little bit involved. I will read it, and then I will ask people to read selected passages from the underlying book by Mr. Hassler. Anyway, the question reads as follows. If we combine the introduction by Hans Küng, attachment 9, with the excerpts from the book by August Bernard Hassler, attachment 12, we find repeated references to the Vatican's tendency to release information about the First Vatican Council of 1870 slowly and selectively, as well as tactics that deserve to be considered high-handed or even tyrannical, e.g. censorship, punishment of dissenting bishops. If you find these accounts convincing, who bears the primary responsibility? Can the events of that council be considered valid and fair? Please explain your conclusions. Now, as I said, I would like to turn to excerpts from that book that is referred to, the book by August Bernard Hassler. And before I do that, I will read the paragraph identifying this author that appears on the dust jacket, specifically on the rear flap of the dust jacket. August Bernard Hassler, before his untimely death in July 1980, served for 5 years in the Vatican Secretariat for Christian Unity, concentrating on work with Lutheran Reform and Old Catholic churches. It was during this time that he was given access to the Vatican archives and discovered diaries, letters, and official documents relating to the First Vatican Council that had never been studied before. So now I would like indeed to turn to specific excerpts. And the first excerpt that I would like to have someone read is the first paragraph on page 1, which is indeed the forward to the first edition. It begins with the sentence, Paul VI laid aside his tiara. Stephen, would you be able to read that paragraph, please?
Yes. Paul VI laid aside his tiara. Both his successors, John Paul I and John Paul II, dispensed with the throne and crown. But the Pope's claim to infallibility has remained, and hence so has their position of power. For power was the issue in 1870, when the First Vatican Council ascribed to the Pope inerrancy in matters of faith and morals, together with the direct sovereignty of the entire church.
Thank you. I would now like to move to page 3 of the same set of excerpts and ask Bob to read the first paragraph that begins, hardly anyone thought it could still happen.
Hardly anyone thought it could still happen, but it has. Papal horn is once again branding.
Excuse me, that's a typo. It should be papal Rome.
Papal what?
Papal Rome.
Papal Rome is once again branding as heretics those unwilling to believe in its infallibility. Of late, events have been following each other in rapid succession. On December 18th, 1979, Professor Hans Küng was stripped of his ecclesiastical teaching privileges. In the future, he can, quote, neither be considered a Catholic teacher nor engage in teaching as such, unquote. A final, quote, attempt at reconciliation between Küng and the Bishop of Rottenburg, George Mosler, on December 30th, 1979, proved to be a failure. The Congregation of the Faith justified its action on the express grounds that in the introduction to this book, and in another piece, Küng had disputed the Pope's infallible magisterium.
Thank you. I would now like to move to page 10 and ask George to read the second paragraph on page 10, which actually extends over into the top of page 11. The second paragraph begins with the words, at first the infallibilists complacently entertained the hope.
Okay. At first, the infallibilists complacently entertained the hope that their goal was achieved. Bishop Claude Plantier said they had succeeded in bringing about the apotheosis of authority. This was for him the most important result of the council. The Roman pontiff's new authority, it was hoped, would also benefit the papal states. But only 2 months after the definition of infallibility, such expectations were cruelly disappointed. The day after the council ended, the Franco-Prussian War broke out. Shortly thereafter, the last French troops left the papal harbor of Civitavecchia, and the Italian government in Florence was finally free to settle the problem of Rome. On September 20th, 1870, the forces of a newly united Italy, under General Raphael Cadorna, stormed the Porta Pia. To the very end, Pius IX had thought it impossible that the Piedmontese would ever tread upon Roman soil. As in other matters, here too the Pope believed in his mystical extravagance that he had been granted a special divine illumination. There is no other way of explaining the imperturbable confidence of his statements during those last days. Full of inner contentment, he could even find the time to work out a rebus, which was quite popular then. But finally, he ordered his general, Hermann Kanzler, to put up a token resistance, which nevertheless caused 70 human lives to be sacrificed to raison d'estate. During the fighting at the city walls, 49 soldiers were killed on the Italian side, while 20 died on the papal side. But this symbolic protest against violent and unjustified Italian aggression could not prevent the loss of Rome once and for all. The situation was not without a certain irony. The dogma of infallibility, which was supposed to prop up the secular power of the Pope, only hastened the process of its disintegration. The new doctrine irritated the governments of Europe and made them apprehensive of church interference in their affairs. Neither France nor Austria nor Germany displayed any willingness to lift a finger to win back his lost territories for the Pope. The whole episode reveals how completely the infallibilists had lost their sense of political reality.
Thank you, George. Stephen, now I'd like you to turn to page 13 and specifically read for us the 4th and 5th paragraphs, beginning with the words, the council's disregard for history.
Okay, the council's disregard for history was pregnant with consequences. The church not only missed its chance for a rapprochement with the scientific scholarship of the day, but began more and more to look like an obstacle to cultural evolution and an enemy of the unprejudiced search for truth. It is hard to deny the justice of such complaints. The way the dogma came to be defined would be proof enough, but the anti-infallibilists had a still more pointed objection. The dogma of infallibility was not just one more doctrine among others. It took a comprehensive position on the issue of truth. It involved a very broad claim, namely, that the Pope could pronounce on questions of faith and morals with guaranteed certainty. The faith was no longer to be brought to light by laborious research and investigation, but by the determination of an infallible authority.
Thank you, Bob. The final excerpt falls to you. It's on page 19, and it is the first paragraph, the new dogma taught. Please read it for us.
The new dogma taught that the Pope was infallible in matters of faith and morals, a uniquely ideological thesis. This claim extends not to one doctrinal statement, but to all of them. It covers every single one. It shields the entire doctrinal structure of the Catholic Church from criticism. Papal infallibility, the former principle, as it were, of Catholicism, becomes the crowning conclusion of the system. The insurance policy is flawless. There can be no appeal from the Pope to any other authority. Infallibility in this context functions as a meta-ideology. The ideologizing. Thank you. Ideologizing of an ideology. That's a bunch of words there. The many ideological elements in the system are protected by a single, constitutive, all-encompassing ideology. The aim of all this is stabilization and integration. Presupposing the fundamental principle of infallibility, the church's entire operation can run smoothly.
Thank you. I would now like to go back to question X6, and for the sake of refreshing the memories of those who are going to answer it, I will read it again. X6, if we combine the introduction by Hans Kung with the excerpts from the book by August Bernard Hasler, we find repeated references to the Vatican's tendency to release information about the First Vatican Council of 1870 slowly and selectively, as well as tactics that deserve to be considered high-handed or even tyrannical, e.g. censorship, punishment of dissenting bishops. If you find these accounts convincing, who bears the primary responsibility? Can the events of that council be considered valid and fair? Please explain your conclusions. Doreen, I recognize you for the first reply.
Aren't I lucky? Okay. So number one, what I have found, and I'm not quite sure that you mentioned it, but I think it said they condemned rationality, liberalism, materialism, pantheism, and naturalism. So, and this began, I imagine people were up in arms, and this started perhaps the divisions in the church. And it said, let's see, it said everybody knows the heresies condemned by the Fathers of Trent rejected the divine magisterium of the church and allowed religious questions to be a matter for the judgment of each individual. They have gradually collapsed into a multiplicity of sects, either at variance or in agreement with one another. And this means many good people have had all faith in Christ destroyed. So, you know, it's like, wow, what they opened up a can of worms. So it said, indeed, the Holy Bible itself, which they at one time claimed to be the sole source of judge of the Christian faith, is no longer to be held divine. And they began to assimilate it to the inventions of myth. So if I'm not mistaken, and it goes on, you know, this is just what I found. I have no personal experience in any of this, but it said that it came into being and spread far and wide throughout the doctrine of, you know, what I just said, rationalism. Now, it was bad. It was opposed to everything. And it said that it spared no effort to bring about that Christ alone, who is the Lord and Savior, is shut out from the minds of people and the moral life of nations. So they, I'm sorry to read, but I can't help it. So the abandonment and rejection of the Christian religion and the denial of God and his Christ has plunged the minds of many into the abyss of pantheism, materialism, atheism, and the consequences that they strive to destroy rational nature itself, to deny any criteria of what is right and just, and to overthrow the very foundations of human society. And I'll stop there. So it said even, you know, it spread in every direction, even with the children. Among the children of the church, it said it strayed from the path of genuine piety, and the truth was gradually diluted.
If I can try to summarize or at least interpret what you've said, I think what you've said is that the emphasis on total authority and conformity disheartened so many people that they ended up rejecting the truths of the text.
Thank you. And this was the decrees of the council that, you know, they said they published. So
thank you. Charles, your turn.
Well, I don't have to review the material concerning issues of conformity, uniformity, obedience. What I'd like to put on the table is 3 points. One, as you know, I was raised Roman Catholic. I suppose I should add, I left the church of my own volition when I was about 20 years old because I wanted to find more of God. Nonetheless, I still respect and have affection for the church as a great-grandmother. And whether or not that's consistent doesn't matter to me. It's just a matter of the heart. In other words, for example, I was taught about angels, and the Rancher book simply expanded that greatly for me. And I'm always very grateful for teachings about angels. And that alone made it worthwhile for me to go to Catholic school from 1949 to 1956, again, a very traditional time, even in New York City, where I was in the Bronx. Anyway, despite the machinations that are referenced in paragraph 6, implied in paragraph 5, the doctrine of papal infallibility, which is what it's really about, was taught to us by sisters and priests, a given. I would say an absolute given. I don't remember. I was open and sensitive to these things. I don't remember anyone ever questioning any aspect of it. It was simply a given. Like someone talking about sunrise and sunset. It's part of the natural landscape. It's part of the whole landscape, not natural, but it's part of God's landscape. So there was equivalence of what was called, and the church was often referred to with the phrase mystical body of Christ. And the actual physical church, the material church, was equated with that, therefore with God and Jesus. Curiously, they just referenced God mostly. Rarely didn't hear that much about Jesus directly, except as the Christ, which he was so lofty. What I find interesting is the Vatican Council of 1870 occurred in the very thicket of the emergence of the modern world. So great forces were at work. Capitalism, beginning with the Dutch in the 17th century, and continued with the English in the 18th century. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the 18th century. The democracy, one of its great advocates, John Locke, publishing in the 1690s. Socialism followed in the 19th century as a critique of capitalism, and the effects of the Renaissance, the long-term effects of the Renaissance and Enlightenment were really coming to the surface. So all these forces were creating 20th century civilization. They're at work, certainly by 1870, anticipating tremendous changes, worldwide and tremendous changes. Granted, they would be manifested initially in the United States, Canada, Europe, then Japan, and so forth, but they would, at least some of them, and democracy. I think I may have left out democracy. These tremendous forces in the middle of all this ever increasing river, this expanding river of civilization, evolutionary civilization, comes a pronouncement that's at first blush and second and third blush appear to be completely anti-modernity. Of course, it hadn't anticipated modern totalitarianism. Putting that whole thing aside, it certainly hadn't anticipated modern democracy, the republic, the emergence of a republic, and a constitutional democracy, a parliamentary democracy, which became the models thereafter and continues today. Contrary to all of that, I don't know what to make of it. I really don't know. It's a phenomenon. It's a spectacle. It's curious. Here you have a church that's nearly 2,000 years old, or at least the presence of Christianity, the Christian world, nearly 2,000 years old, albeit fragmented and divided. Nonetheless, it's still the same Christ. It's still the same heaven. It's the same Father in heaven. Same Moses. Same Judeo-Christian tradition. All of that is still the same. I mean, there are many points to tie it together, and it comes up with articulates and asserts this this phenomenal doctrine that humans are, that a man can be infallible. Of course, he's not a man, and that's not the man that's infallible, it's the office that's infallible. But in practice, the man figures largely in that. It certainly is a male thing, I think. In my opinion, it's in many ways a male thing, not to disparage my gender. It's not my intent, but I'm afraid most men do these things. Men think these things and assert these things. You don't have that many female Lenins, Hitlers, Stalins, Roosevelts, Churchills, Gandhis. Just don't. Not at the highest levels of attention. But right in the middle of the modern world, ready to be born, in a sense, really forces converging, both from the democratic polarity to a totalitarian polarity. This thing is issued, this infallibility. And nonetheless, within the context of the Catholic Church, circa 1949 to 1956, it was doctrine unassailable. There was no basis for criticism, no room for criticism. I encountered that when I was 10 years old in the 5th grade on another issue. There's simply infallibility was a fact, was treated as a fact, and was the truth of the matter in faith and morals, as has been said several times today by others on the panel. And I find that interesting. Why would one of the older religions, one of the great world religions on Urantia, come up with a notion that was, as far as I can discern, is completely anti-modern, aside from the totalitarian governments again. And there they have that in common. I don't think, though, it speaks for all of Christianity. I don't think it does. I think I don't want to put so much emphasis on this notion and this tension and this emergence, seemingly so contradictory, so inconsistent with the secular world, that took much of its power away several centuries ago, or had been in the process of taking power away over the century, several centuries. I don't want to suggest that it's the last word or ever was the last word. I know the Church is more liberal on the issue because Catholics have told me that. Sincere practicing Catholics, it's not the same Church in a sense, not quite the same, that it was 60 years ago when I was a boy. Nevertheless, it's a very curious thing to have infallibility asserted in the context of emerging modernity. It's very curious. There's also something else that's curious to me. If you assume that papal infallibility is so erroneous, is palpably erroneous, certainly from the point of view of modernity it is. It's even ludicrous. It's ridiculous from the point of view of modernity. How does one explain that approximately 1/3 of humanity, a little bit less, is Christian, and of that, about half is Roman Catholic? That, too, is very curious. How does one explain that? Well, I'm not sure. People I mentioned about sheep and the shepherds and status and all that, and but that doesn't cover it to me. I'm not satisfied even with that kind of analysis. And I'm closed with this observation, which I wrote down so I didn't miss anything. It's brief, it's only 2 sentences. And I think as a panel, we ought to give it much more attention, in my view. I agree. Stephen alluded to this early in the session. Here's what I wrote. I just wrote it about a half hour ago. Relative failure to acknowledge the significance of the spiritual content of the Christian world is itself, I think, a mistake. To deny its presence is to suggest or imply the religion of Jesus does not lie within the undertow of Christianity, is how I expressed it, however hidden it may be. Actually, it's 3 sentences. I added that, changed the sentence. Roman Catholic Catholicism, notwithstanding my personal disagreement with it, notwithstanding that I have no wish to be a Catholic or any other Christian per se, even though I have great affection and respect for all the Christian sects, Orthodox, and I've been to their services, Baptist, Roman Catholic, and others. Notwithstanding any of that, there's something else going on. There's something very big going on in the Christian world. To have those kinds of numbers, to be, for the Roman Catholic Church, despite this papal infallibility and whatever else one could lay at its doorstep, it is a power to be reckoned with. And there are so many examples of it. One that really impressed me.
Charles,
Okay, I'll stop.
thank you. I'm conscious of the time. I have to give appropriate opportunities to.
Yes, my apologies.
Okay.
I just got carried away.
Thank
I was
you.
enthusiastic. Go ahead.
Thank you for your cooperation. George, in reviewing the contents of what others have said, I note that no one up to now has addressed the very practical side at the end of my question. Who bears the primary responsibility for what happened at the First Vatican Council in 1870? And can the events of that council be considered valid and fair? Without prejudicing your ability to go into other aspects, I hope you will address those points.
Well, I'll try to, and I'll try to use the paradigm you suggested earlier, origin, history, and destiny. It seems to me the origin traces back to the Middle Ages, when the Catholic Church really had a totalitarian grip on the entire Western world. By the time 1870 rolls around, that's pretty much history. They don't have that kind of control anymore. So the history of that loss of control, I think, is part of the explanation for this really inexplicable foray into infallibility. It's, I think they felt tremendously threatened by the rise of secular civilization, science, everything that we've been talking about. They felt tremendously threatened by it. I mean, a couple of centuries before, they were directly threatened by the Reformation. Now civilization itself is taking a secular turn, which is in many ways a larger threat to the Catholic religion. And so I think this was, whether it's understandable or not, that's a question you can debate, but it seems to me there's some legitimacy to the idea that they were afraid of being overwhelmed. And so their response was to try to return to the control that they once had over society. And the only way they could think of doing that was by saying, well, the Pope is infallible, therefore you have to listen to us. And so, I mean, in terms of origin, history, and destiny, that's my answer.
Thank you, Stephen.
I was making the same point that George was just making about the church clearly felt that it needed to circle the wagons. And the way you circle the wagons is with the magisterium and the doctrine of infallibility. That, what seemed to do the trick for them. But in historical terms, it's completely understandable. I did want to read this last paragraph from the Encyclopedia Britannica selection that you gave us to read. I thought this was interesting. The exact responsibility of Pius IX for the events of his pontificate is still a matter of controversy, but it may be said that Pius IX took the first steps toward the modern papacy. Here's the important part. Church and state were increasingly separated. Authority in the church was centralized in Rome, and the church was ranged in opposition to some of the dominant movements of the modern age, including liberal capitalism, communism, extreme nationalism, and the racism that culminated in Nazism. Under the direction of Pius IX, the papacy abandoned the political preoccupations and responsibilities imposed by the temporal power it once possessed and concentrated on spiritual and religious issues. So, separation of church and state was encouraged by Pius IX And the church was ranged against the things that the Urantia book are ranged against, which are liberal capitalism, and I take that to mean the excesses of liberal capitalism, which the book speaks against, communism, which I think the book speaks against, maybe not directly, extreme nationalism, which the book speaks against, and racism that culminated in Nazism. So that's an interesting comparison. What I will say is that the church did not assert its opposition to either democracy or science. It was not included in that list. So that's all very interesting to think about in this context, kind of a little different than we've been talking about.
Thank you. I would simply comment on your remarks, which are well justified in the general sense, that Pope Pius IX accepted the separation of church and state because the Italian army conquered his territory against his wishes, and his desire to fight going down cost the lives of quite a few people. The outcome of that fight was preordained. He had no chance, and nevertheless, he caused quite a number of Italians to die in that defense of Rome that at his request. Bob, I think your chances are here now. I hope you will use the fact that we have gone beyond our 2-hour time and be relatively brief.
Yes, I can be brief because I totally agree with what George said and with what Steve said. The Vatican I was, had to push back on secularism. That's I kind of said that earlier in slightly different words, is that they were fighting against modernism, and this whole idea I drew a circle around what Steve brought up: the separation of church and state, liberal capitalism, communism, extreme nationalism, and racism. These are all things that are at the forefront even today. The other isms, I suppose, and without sticking to what Jesus really wanted, after his death, things to happen. We're kind of stuck in this, that the church is still stuck into being part of the secular society itself.
Thank you. I appreciate your relatively brief remarks, and I believe we've had a vigorous discussion, once again demonstrating the principle of pluralism and diversity. We will continue next week with question X7, although I will note for the record that some of Charles's comments already addressed that point about the doctrine of papal infallibility, whereas Charles either consciously or unconsciously understood that he will not be participating next week. So he, in fact, already gave his answer to question X7. And I believe we will then spend perhaps a third to a half of our session next week on questions X7, X8, and X9. And then we will go on to my new essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. So lady and gentlemen, I appreciate your contributions today. We have had an extremely interesting discussion, and I look forward to another discussion likewise interesting that we will conduct next week. Thank you, Bob.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.